Hello and welcome to another episode of Bidisha Nomics, where our consulting editor for economics, Bidisha Bhattacharya, takes your questions on the world economic status where India lands. And we have very interesting, very detailed questions this time, Bidisha. So I'll start with Krishna's question on decentralization of power. They are asking, can decentralization of power to state and local government help India grow economically better?
So, this is indeed a very interesting question. And before we get into the impact decentralization would have on the Indian economy, let's quickly first understand what decentralization implies.
Right.
It basically implies the transfer of responsibilities and power from the center to the states in terms of financial authority, administrative capability, administrative responsibility. Think of it like a household where, one particular member is responsible for every other member in the large household, and every other family member has a different preference, has a different quality, talent of their own. So catering to each and every requirement would make it a highly inefficient and be very difficult for one particular member of the family. As a result of which, I believe the short answer to it is yes, decentralization would indeed help or impact economic growth positively. However, here I would like to talk about specifically, the principle of subsidiarity, because after decentralization, the principle of subsidiarity talks about that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level, closest to the people who are the most affected. As a result of which, this principle of subsidiarity matters a lot in decentralization. To be specific, let's get into what are the benefits of it. First would be better decision making. Now, state governments or local governments are much more privy to the problems and understand the regions much better than the central government. So, for instance, if I'm talking about a coastal region, say for instance Kerala, they would prioritize in fisheries or tourism. An inland state, for instance Madhya Pradesh, would focus more on agriculture or manufacturing. The requirement or the areas of investment changes. So as a result, better decision making or the resources would be tailored to the right kind of needs, and that would overall promote or enhance the national growth as well. Moving to the second reason, which would be faster implementation. Now, we have time and again discussed about this even in the last episode when I was talking about the reforms,
Right.
be it factor market reforms or legal reforms. Time lags or delay has led to a lot of delay in development in the Indian economy and growth as a whole. Now, decentralization actually narrows down or reduces that time lag. So, faster implementation, because the power now or autonomy lies on the state government or sort of the urban local body, or let's say the local governments in that particular situation. When it comes to innovation, when it comes to implementation, understanding what is required even in the midst of the production process can be catered to directly instead of again going back in the hierarchy and seeking permission for the
Right.
same. Third is very important, this is not discussed much, which is innovation and competition between the states. Now, what happens is when state governments get a certain amount of autonomy or in decentralization, every state starts competing with one another for investment.
Okay.
So, of course, I mean, as a result, there are certain states which would emerge as global manufacturing hubs, or like good manufacturing, large manufacturing hubs. There would be states that would be focusing on services, on innovation, on tourism specifically, and overall that would lead to development. I'll give you a small example of a country, Germany. Germany has done this specifically where they have transferred certain power and responsibilities and empowered, rather I would say, to the states. The states are called Länder, if I'm not wrong, in Germany, and as a result, some of the states have sort of emerged as global manufacturing hubs. There are some states in Germany which have been doing really well in innovation, in especially in the mathematical and science STEM research area as well. And also there are regions, there are states that have been doing very well in the services sector. So this is something that specifically needs to be kept in mind. There is also another very good advantage, I would say, when it comes to decentralization that I did not mention earlier would be more accountability.
Right.
Now, the people or the citizens of that particular state would know who would be the particular person to who would be put into question if things don't go right.
Right.
Who is the person that they can reach out to in terms of implementation or understanding how certain sectors are performing, and what is the need and requirement in that particular sector. This is something that works really well in decentralization. Now, as I said, of course, it sounds like a wonderful policy prescription, but decentralization is not a magic solution. It comes with its own constraints. The
Right.
first being capacity constraints. Now, capacity constraints basically imply that certain states are heavily endowed with certain resources, and then there are states that are weaker, let's say economically or industrially. Now, what happens? That leads to, when decentralization takes place, these economically affluent states may grow faster, whereas the weaker states will be lagging behind. In that particular situation, it is up to the government to make sure that fiscal transfers or the right kind of funding takes place, or availability of funding is there, so that equity is maintained across states. Another big problem that doesn't get much highlighted on is policy coordination.
Okay.
Now, what is policy coordination? For instance, when there is decentralization, every state is specializing in the area that it is affluent in. It can be manufacturing or services or innovation or education, social sector. Now, what happens in that process? All of them have different rules and regulations that they are following, their own form of rules and regulations. And in that process, say for instance, if a business wants to operate across states, across India, it gets very difficult for that business to operate, because they have to operate as per the rules and regulations of that particular state.
Right.
This is a big problem of decentralization. So this is where, of course, central state coordination is important.
Right.
Having a discussion around, proper available transfers, proper available funding, in order to ensure not only efficiency but also equity, and also making sure that if there are businesses that are growing, if a particular state is being empowered from the manufacturing point of view and they are growing and expanding, these kind of contract enforcements or regulatory issues don't hold them back.
Right.
So this would be my response.
Vidisha, that was so incisive, and these questions also tell us how glued in our audience are, because like a lot of big state elections are coming up this year, next year. So the next question is by Srijan Rawat on UP. They're asking, what is the current state of UP's economy?
Of course, very important question. And here, I like the fact that we just spoke about decentralization, and now we are kind of moving towards talking about a particular state, which contributes approximately 8 to 9% to India's total GDP. So UP is a state that is not just participating in the economic development or economic growth in this country. It is one of the key drivers of growth in India. So if I have to talk about UP, because majorly the discussions that take place around Uttar Pradesh is about the structural challenges or the structural transitions. But I want to talk about the speed and the scale and begin with the size of the economy. Because when we are talking about economics, the size of the economy matters a great deal. And UP's GSDP, which is the gross state domestic product, is approximately 30 to 31 lakh crore rupees at this point in time. And they are targeting in the near term to reach to 35 to 36 lakh crore. And the growth has been very interesting and massive since, say, 2010 or 2011. I mean, the growth has been from 13 lakh crore to between 30 to 31 lakh crore, which pretty much implies that they have grown by 10 to 11% annually every year. So UP is a state that is clearly not stagnant. It is growing, and it is growing significantly. Now, as I was talking about the 8 to 9% contribution, it's important to understand, as we were saying, the gross state domestic product more than doubled, and in nominal terms, they have been increasing by 10 to 11%. Ye to ho gaya about size. Now, when we are saying, okay, fine, this is the growth has been quite fast, but in economics, or to really understand how a state is faring, growth does not give the entire picture.
Okay.
It's important to understand where is the growth coming from. This is where we move to economic structure of Uttar Pradesh. Now, the economic structure of Uttar Pradesh is very interesting. Okay, they have a very strong agricultural sector. A large percentage of the Uttar Pradesh population is involved in the agricultural sector.
Right.
They have a strong rural base. At the same time, from an industry perspective as well, they have been doing well, specifically in the micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs, and also manufacturing. Then coming to services, services contribute the largest share to this output that goes from Uttar Pradesh. Now, why is it interesting? Because in the last episode, as we had discussed, when there is a structural transformation happening, economies usually grow from agriculture to industry to services. And Uttar Pradesh is a state that seems to be in the midst of this transition at this point, which is why you see a strong rural base,
Right.
a strong agricultural base, and at the same time, a massive or significant growth in industrial ambition. Now, here it would be very important to highlight, okay, fine, we've understood the economic structure now. So now it's important to understand, if three sectors are either growing or doing very well or are very strong, we need to understand what is the income level of Uttar Pradesh. Okay, so now the interesting bit is when we look at the income levels, we see that the per capita income of Uttar Pradesh lies in approximately 1.1 lakh per year, the per capita income, I would say. So specifically, when we look at this number, we see, okay, fine, a state is growing economically by 10 to 11% annually, but the per capita income is not growing as much. What is the reason behind it? The reason behind it first is employment quality.
Okay.
So if a large part of population is involved still in the agricultural sector, the rural sector, there is lowered pay involved and lower productivity involved. Moving to the industrial bit, this is where a disparity kind of emerges, where we see the western UP region, the western Uttar Pradesh has been doing very well when it comes to industry and services, but eastern UP is lagging behind. Third comes specifically on the rural programs or the rural sector programs specifically. So now what we are seeing is that especially there is a disparity or a misconstruing, in terms of the rural employment programs. It's not really working well at this point in Uttar Pradesh, because a lot of households are pulling themselves out or are dropping out in between the rural employment program. So I believe that job skilling, from a job skilling perspective, from an administrative perspective, even from a bureaucratic perspective, the government needs to delve deeper and look into where are things going wrong, so that a state which contributes significantly to India's GDP should not have a per capita income that is on the lower side compared to the growth that's taking place. And this also shows us, and it's a classic example in macroeconomics, when people say you should not look only at GDP as an indicator for how an entire economy is performing, and even in India this is taking place, where we are looking at the upper layer who are contributing to massive wealth, but if we look at the middle class, there is an interesting book that Saurabh Mukherjee has written, which is Breakpoint, that talks about the middle class crisis, where savings is falling and they are relying heavily on credit. So it's important to understand, not to look just at the growth number, but also at the different stages of productivity and empowerment and employment, so that only growth is not taking place, but that is leading to increase in aggregate demand and also employment.
Right. And Bidisha, now that we're talking about state performances and how states are allocating funds, our next question is also by Srijan. They're asking about the freebie policy that a lot of states have implemented. They're asking, how long can the freebie policy taken by parties work for major states like Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu? For how long can they sustain it, and when will they have to redirect funds from development projects, if so?
Of course, this is an important question, and I would like to tie it with what's happening from the external and global shocks perspective here. So it's very visible when things don't go right, or when this entire policy of freebies crosses that line where debt starts rising, deficit starts rising, and interest payments kind of pick up. Now, all that couple of states that have been mentioned, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, all of them are quite affluent, and from an income perspective, these are in a stable and healthy, safe position that way. So if they indulge in welfare spending, they wouldn't be in a difficult debt situation.
Right.
Now, what happens in this particular position? Freebies are, of course, politically very attractive. Every political party loves giving freebies and subsidies. Now, firstly, it's important to understand freebies can fall under a couple of umbrellas. One of them can be welfare spending, one can be transfers, one can be providing the basic necessities, for instance, electricity, clean water. So, in general, all freebies are not bad. The very concept of freebies, just saying that this is not right, that would be an incorrect statement to make. Now it's important to understand there are certain macroeconomic targets that the government gives or RBI gives. RBI follows a strict inflation targeting framework at 4% with a medium term of 4% plus 2 minus 2. Similarly, the Finance Commission of India gives fiscal deficit target to every state, or to maintain it at around 3% of GSDP, the gross state domestic product. Now, when this target kind of gets breached in the process of more freebies and giving away of a lot of transfers where it's not even needed, for instance, just for a couple of votes, say for instance, then what happens when the deficit rises? That leads to increase in debt.
Right.
Now, when debt levels rise, interest payments rise. Now comes a very interesting bit. This was a discussion that I had on defense budget, and Snehesh and we had done a thorough study on the defense budget, and there's a Cut the Clutter episode regarding it as well, where we looked into the two different kinds of expenditure that any state, any budget, any sector can do. One is revenue expenditure and the other is capital expenditure. Now, revenue expenditure specifically focuses on salaries, subsidies, pensions, these kind of basically that would affect the regular day-to-day livelihood or the standard of living of citizens. Second comes capital expenditure, which focuses on infrastructure, roads, railways, highways that would transport, buildings, sort of, social sector, different sectors. So this is the capital expenditure. Now, when this debt level starts rising or the interest payments start rising, because the cost of borrowing now has increased.
Right.
State is borrowing more to meet the basic needs of people because they gave away most of their money in the form of freebies.
Right.
As a result, the first expenditure they cut down is actually one of the most important expenditure, which is capital expenditure. Because salaries, they can't stop overnight. Welfare, subsidies, freebies is something, if they stop, they won't garner the right kind of votes. That's politically unattractive. As a result, capital expenditure is the one that bears the brunt. Now, when capital expenditure bears the brunt, you immediately start noticing that infrastructure investment drops in an economy, in a state, which is why every state is not performing equally well. Let's take the example of Punjab. Punjab at one point gave a lot of these, transfers, different kinds of transfers, also freebies, and that led to huge debt levels in Punjab. And as a result, the interest payments picked up. Now, when that happened, every time, and it's very visible, the minute interest payments pick up, you will notice that even the slogans or the promises that are being made now kind of shifts from infrastructure or making roads or immediate kind of infrastructure spending to more of salaries, more of freebies. It's like a vicious loop, basically. And focusing on, okay, long-term investment. In 10 years, we'll build something here and there, depending on how much of the deficit is paid by then. So I would say that freebies are not all bad, but if, just like any other economic factor or any other transfer, if not regulated well, things can go haywire. Of course, Punjab is not the only example. There are other examples as well of states where debt levels are very high, and that is now hitting the capital expenditure side.
Bidisha, that's definitely very interesting, and delving deeper into the federal structure, which also dictates how our economy functions and how our money gets allocated. The next question is by Anubhav Saxena. They're asking, why are Indian municipalities always starved of funds? Is it only a political setup, or what is the financial setup issue behind it? And what international model shall Indian municipalities follow?
Um, I really like the framing of this question because it did not stop at what's going wrong, but what
Yeah.
are the international models that can be followed. So, what are municipalities? Municipalities are basically city governments that deal with your day to day requirements.
Right.
Something that we call as local public goods, roads, public health, drainage, sanitation, sidewalks, all of these things are handled by municipalities. But however, sadly, in the Indian system, although the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, after being passed, gives a lot of weightage to urban local bodies, still the amount of control that municipalities have is between 0.7 to 1% roughly of the Indian total GDP in revenues, which is in comparison to, let's say, 3% in the US, 3 to 4%. Now, why this mismatch?
Right.
It's important to understand first that cities are a very politically lucrative area. So when it comes to, let's say, tax collection, different kind of tax collection, or infrastructure spending, or understanding the rules, states would like to have more, or the state governments try to have more autonomy in this particular area. Now, what happens is municipalities, to understand why this mismatch, and it's very deep rooted and something that can be solved very easily, and definitely needs to have more discussions regarding this. So, one, there will be two umbrellas that I would put municipality issue or this mismatch under, one being the political economy and the other being the financial structure. Political economy, as I just stated, the state governments would like to, or like to hold a certain amount of power, because cities hold political sort of votes, are politically lucrative, and grants. And also from a financial structure perspective, municipalities have, the taxes that they collect are property taxes, which are very low compared to 0.2% of the total GDP, which is a very low amount of tax collection. Then comes the grants that they receive from center and the state, which form a huge, significant sort of chunk of the funds that they get. But then that comes with its own set of rules and regulations, where the independence or the empowerment of municipalities kind of disappears.
Right.
And then definitely coming to municipal bonds, we do have certain municipal bonds, but they are not enough for infrastructure development, or and that's also there in certain states, not all states. So in this particular situation, I would like to quote not only the example of United States, where property taxes that are collected is between 3 to 4%. As a result, they can take a lot of decisions, and immediately, again coming to faster implementation, they can immediately make changes, or listen to the citizens in terms of the basic local public goods that can be catered to right away, instead of doing the back and forth with the state governments and the center. Then coming to Brazil, after the 1988 constitutional reforms, Brazil had decided to give a guaranteed return of the center and the state's collection of the taxes. Now, that basically, what that does is that enhances predictability and also stability.
Right.
Now, municipalities know that for sure this chunk of money is going to come to us annually, and then the basic needs of that city can be immediately met. This is something that India needs to learn from, and India needs to work on it. Otherwise, the entire model, the very city government that is responsible for the most important things, the day-to-day activities, the day-to-day requirements that the citizens of the particular city needs, this model is kind of have become more financially dependent rather than financially empowered. So I believe this is a very, very important question, and this shouldn't stop at just me answering, but this discussion should continue as to giving more power to urban local bodies specifically.
Right. So, Bidisha, coming to the last question of today's episode, which is by Nikun Sanghai, they're asking, fiat currencies have been printing their way out of their fiscal deficits. Elevated bond yields for them make sense. What explains the divergence in India, which did not adopt policy of fiscal stimulus post-COVID and has been steadily consolidating Indian government bond yield, which has reached 7%? What best explains investors demanding such a risk premium, especially at the long end of the bond yield curve?
Interesting. This has something to do with what's happening externally. So, first let's simplify or break this down as to what is a government bond yield.
Right.
A government bond yield is simply the interest rate that the government pays when it borrows money. Now, why is it 7% at this point, where in the US it's approximately between 4 to 4.5%. Here, it's important to understand, and I have very recently written a piece around this as well, which is understanding the importance or the center stage that expectations have taken in instead of the actual parameters, be it inflation, be it uncertainty, be it risk for that matter. Earlier, if we look at the data before 2023, we saw that when inflation was increasing, interest rates were also increasing. I mean, classic textbook macroeconomic concept and macroeconomic relation. After 2023, however, the relationship, I wouldn't say changes, but doesn't hold for certain periods.
Right.
So that kind of goes on to show that interest rates, I mean, despite inflation falling, interest rates are still staying high, because markets have been starting to factor in uncertainty way more than they were doing so earlier. Let's take, for example, term premium, the very concept of term premium. I've written about this in the piece as well. Term premium is basically, for instance, the government borrows, or I decide to invest 1 lakh rupees to the government, in the Indian government for a year. It's fine. But for 10 to 20 years, if the government is holding my 1 lakh rupees, then of course I will ask questions as to what will be my return if tomorrow inflation goes to double digit levels. What will be my return if uncertainty rises even further? If this war continues, will I even get my return? How stable is the government of India that I will not be experiencing a default? Will there be a debt crisis in the future? Keeping all these uncertainties in mind, and as these uncertainties keep increasing, this term premium, or the additional compensation that as an investor I would ask for, would also keep increasing.
Right.
Now, back in 2010, 2011, there's a very interesting Barclays report on this. In 2010, 2011, term premium was very low, or even in negative levels, because it was a fairly stabler environment than what we have right now. But right now, the term premium has been significantly increasing and ballooning for that matter. Now, as a result, in this particular instance, it's important to understand investors outside India are not only just looking at India, they are looking at other economies as well, and that's where competition comes and plays an important picture. And at the same time, if US is offering 4 to 4.5%, for India to look as a more attractive zone, being an emerging economy, being coming along with its emerging market risks or inflation risks, it's important for us to give sort of 2.5 to 3% more, which is where the 7% factor comes into the picture. So it's not that we are probably not putting in a lot of thought, but we are keeping the inflation expectations, how bond yields would be behaving in the long run in mind, when we have kept the 7% specifically. Now, coming to another important point, which is, not being talked about much, is that of course the government is reducing its deficit. The target for the government is to reduce its deficit. It's doing so, but at the same time, the government is also, even now, the amount of borrowing that the government is doing is still high, which is 15 to 16 lakh crore per year. which needs to narrow down. And this is where a lot of import substitution or reducing import dependency comes into the picture. Certain areas where we are importing, which we can easily sort of boost our production or incentivize, even not just from an agricultural perspective, but from a manufacturing perspective, from an innovation perspective as well. That is up to governments, to the government of India, to specifically provide the right kind of fiscal stimulus, the right kind of incentives, so that when you're reducing the deficit, at the same time you're not borrowing more, so then your debt automatically narrows down. This would be specifically why the 7% number is there, and we are not being able to reduce it, because we have to look as a lucrative and an attractive zone when it comes to investments. And it's important to understand that when we are being looked at from outside, India is not looked at as an individual entity, but it is looked at in comparison to a Mexico, to a Russia, to a China, every other economy around us, which is why this 7% to be specific.
Bidisha, that was incredibly incisive, and this was an episode that was definitely a deep dive. Thank you to our members for your questions that keep us sharp. We will be back next week with another episode of Bidisha Nomics.